Hello and welcome once again to the Sophie Scholl Society. I'm Mel McGinnis, and as you know, as you've been tuning in, this show talks about the two forbidden subjects, religion and politics. You've seen this white notebook. This white notebook contains the 6 leaflets of the White Rose Society. And that White Rose Society, when distributed in Nazi Germany, was forbidden. Sophie and her brother did this at the risk of their own lives. And as they were caught, as you know and have heard, basically from week to week, Sophie Scholl and her brother lost their lives. We're going to be talking about a subject today that if this book was circulated in Germany, I'm sure they would have found out or tried to find out who was the one who authored it, and anybody caught distributing it would have been arrested. To talk about it with me today is Dr. Deanne Nelson. Deanne, welcome to the Sophie Scholl Society.
Thank you very much, Mel. I'm glad to be here.
And what book do you have with us that you've been reading, which is very significant with respect to the subject of religion and politics?
Well, it's a book by David Horowitz, and it's called Dark Agenda, The War to Destroy Christian America. And Horowitz is interesting because he came from a radical family, and now he's converted to be a conservative and writing about the issues of conservatism and radicalism in our country.
It's interesting. He started out, like you say, as a leftist radical back in the late 50s and 60s.
Right.
And he began to see that it was riddled with all kinds of errors and false philosophy, and has become a conservative, though I would say he still would say he's an agnostic.
Yes, he does.
And yet he recognizes that the dark agenda is out there to destroy Christianity. And that destructive force from the left is vented towards anything that is Christian.
Right.
What were some examples that you read about that showed this kind of effort being exerted by the left?
Well, I think some of the legislation that has come about from the Supreme Court shows examples of the radicalness of the left, because they bypassed democracy. They bypassed the local or state legislatures, and they went directly to the Supreme Court, where they found a favorable response in their behalf. And that started out with Engel versus Vitale in 1962. And this was a suit brought before the Supreme Court by 3 Jewish people and 2 atheists, and who objected to the voluntary prayer that was created by or written by the New York State Regents. And so they found a favorable response in the Supreme Court, and this was based on the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, which says that no establishment of religion, they rejected the Establishment Clause, that no establishment of a religion in America. So there was another case, too, of Madeleine Murray, who was the most hated woman in America, and she was a person who was bitter, fighting with her family all the time. She had a 14-year-old son, and she began to ask him what went on in school, and she learned that every day they said the Lord's Prayer in his school. And so then she brought forth a suit of Murray versus Curlett, which was to get Bible, prayer, religion out of the Baltimore schools. And she took that to the Supreme Court, and she was joined by another suit, the Abington School District versus Schempp. And of course, they won a favorable response on that suit. So we have these attacks on religion in our country. Plus, we see a lot of other instances of radicalism now being foisted upon the American people. trying to bring us to more of a Marxist society than a Christian society.
The two don't go together,
No, they don't go
Marxism
together.
and Christianity. And you can see the efforts of the left's agenda to engage in religious cleansing.
Right.
As the cases you brought about there in the 1960s, and I heard Horowitz talk about him remembering those times when he would pray the Lord's Prayer. And even as a Jew, he really didn't mind it. And as we see these examples of what was done in the schools, we see an evisceration of the constitutional process, meaning government overstepped their bounds.
Exactly.
The Supreme Court had no right to interfere into what power belonged to the state.
That's right, they didn't.
And yet those individuals found those who would be favorable to them, so that the Supreme Court became like a super legislature and imposed its opinion upon the state. Because when we look at the Constitution, how many times do we find the word education in it?
We don't find the word education in it. And many of these examples here were not based upon the Constitution. For instance, if we went a little further, knowing now how to use the Supreme Court, in Griswold versus Connecticut, this was about contraceptions. There had been a law saying that contraceptions could not be used, but now someone challenged this. Well, they won based on what was called the right of privacy, but there is nothing about right of privacy in the Constitution. And the Supreme Court justices said, well, these came under, in the shadow of other rights, but this was just a way of getting this liberal agenda into the public. I think what was so tragic is that by going to the Supreme Court and bypassing local and state avenues, they inflicted on an entire country, no matter what your beliefs were, no matter what your community was like, they inflicted on an entire country their desires for no Christianity, no prayer. And then, of course, it went on to Roe versus Wade, which was even more dramatic, and the woman's right to her own body, and this is what they were saying.
So we saw this judicial activism
Yeah.
really snowball in the 60s, and the 70s brought about Roe v. Wade. And we noticed that judges basically imposed their opinions
Right.
and did not apply the Constitution to the case.
That's right.
Because when we go back to education, if you find nothing in the Constitution about it, therefore the federal government ought to have nothing to do with it. And here you have the federal court of the Supreme Court deciding this for a state, for a local school district, when Amendment 10 of the Constitution says this. That is, the powers delegated to the state and not prohibited by the federal government belong to the state and to the people. Let me read it specifically. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. That says that education belongs in the domain of the states and the people to decide these things for themselves without the intrusion of the federal government entering in. Well, we've gone for about 10 minutes here. We'll pick it up next time with a local case that has occurred in our county, Chautauqua County, with a school district that was bullied by an outside group to shut down baccalaureate taking place in the school and eliminating prayers at graduation. Join us next time for Sophie Scholl.